Hey guys, it's him.
And I.
And today, as students, we're going to discuss one of our favorite classes, KPE 404. But before that, please, I'm begging you, like and subscribe.
Don't forget to hit the bell notification button too.
Because it's rough out here, man. It's rough. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into some of the concepts we learned in our class. And we're going to apply them to our lives. And more importantly, the lives that we went through during COVID and through quarantine.
So basically what we're going to do is we're just going to take a look at all the modules and all the content that we've learned throughout the semester. And we're going to kind of focus it on a topic that we're very familiar with, which is substance use and abuse. And we're basically just trying to get a breakdown of how the modules relate to each other and how all of the different factors relate to our lives and our experiences during COVID. So first we're going to start off with one of the earlier topics that we talked about in the semester, and that was the sense of self. So like, what do you think, or what do you describe sense of self as?
I think sense of yourself is like, it's based on like a few things. It's based on one, like how you feel about yourself, and it's also about how you think the world sees you, and then how you actually really do fit into your given environment. What about you?
Yeah, honestly, that's pretty much the same description that I would have for sense of self.
Yeah. What is your sense of self?
So, my sense of self is very like secure. You know, I'm very confident in myself and the things that I do, and I think that.
Do you feel like you have identities?
Yeah, like I identify myself as a student, a woman, an entrepreneur. You know, there's various things that I identify as. What about you?
Yeah. Well, I definitely identify as like I want to be like considered like a man, you know,
Yeah.
right? That's a big sense of self of mine. But then at the same time, I also want to be considered a kid, you know, and like in terms of like what I want to be like described in as the community, like the community by the community. And so by the community, I wanted to be seen as someone that was like strong-minded. And like one thing definitely over the last few years that everyone's had to deal with is COVID, right? So it's like those times they really tested your strength and your will, and like it definitely affected your sense of self. Like for me, like it was like you're totally removed from your like ecosystem and like the people, like your peers and everything, and it was complete isolation, and you were left with just like yourself. And then if you were lucky, you had like people living with you, so you weren't in complete isolation. But what about you?
No, I definitely agree with that. You know, during COVID and quarantine, I feel like my sense of self was kind of lost, but then found. And this was specific to when I got COVID literally last week. You know, I spent a week in quarantine and I felt really isolated. Like I had lost my sense of self because I felt like I was just my illness.
Do you feel like you're in a box?
Yeah, exactly. You know, I felt like I had to be locked in my room. But at the same time, spending all that time in my room by myself kind of forced me to discover who I am, what I'm meant to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It kind of forced me to have, like, I guess you could say a spiritual awakening or something like that. But I feel like I totally rediscovered my sense of self.
Yeah, and what's it called? For me, I did too, and one of the ways was definitely the marijuana, you know?
Yeah, that also definitely changed my sense of self, you know?
Yeah.
I feel like when I was younger, something really strong about my sense of self was that I never did any drugs. I was always, like, very what do you call, like, a straight,
Strong-minded.
yeah, strong-minded and completely against drugs, but now I feel like it's just become a part of who I am.
Same with me. Like back in grade like 12, like like at the start of grade 12, I never thought I was doing drugs or drinking alcohol. I thought I was always gonna be like the designated driver, you know.
Yeah.
And then it's silly, but a girl broke my heart, and then I started smoking weed, and I fell in love with it, you know. And I didn't use it that much before COVID, right? And I never thought I was a person that was gonna smoke every single day. And I used to think like smoking on the weekends, just the weekends, was bad, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, now, like, after COVID and, like, coming out of COVID, like, it's shaped my personality partly. And, like, the thing is that before I couldn't see myself as someone that didn't smoke every day. And now I can't see myself as someone who doesn't smoke every single day.
I see what you mean. And I remember when we first met in first year,
Mm-hmm.
I used to smoke more than you.
Yeah.
And now it's about the same.
Yeah. So back to one of the things you said. You know, you said the word stigma, and that's one of our next concepts. So, can you tell me some of the stigmas you had about addiction?
You know, when I was younger, I had this stigma that, like, everybody who smoked weed was like a rule breaker, you know, kind of like a rebel. And then I slowly got introduced to it in my late years in high school. Like, I would smoke when I went to parties and stuff. And I didn't like the way that it made me feel. So I still had a stigma against it. I was still like, no, that's too, like, it's too risky.
It's crazy. I know that it's too risky thought, and then 2 years down the road, you find yourself and you're like, bruh, this was risky for me?
Yeah, like, I find myself being functional while high.
Yeah.
Something that I could have never imagined, because I had so much stigma that, like, if you did drugs, you were just a bad person, you know?
I definitely had that thought too, and, like, now I definitely understand there's a lot more to it. Like, a lot of it's, like, I think for many people it's actually like a coping mechanism, you know? Like, or something that, like, they can take a break from. Like, I definitely know on my hard days, I definitely think, like, I need to call up my best friend, let's go, like, you know, smoke a spliff or something.
Yeah.
Right? And, like, I'm not gonna name, like, other, like, substances I've taken, but, like, I've gotten, like, a sense of, like, the feelings and emotions that are attached to it, and I understand why some of these things are so irresistible to people, and why people fall into, like, the
Addiction?
the trap of addiction. Yeah.
No, I get that. You know, I feel like because inherently personally there was a spike in my substance use during quarantine and COVID. And I feel like the stigma around substance use kind of decreased. I can see in, like, my social circle that it's not as prominent as it used to be. And in, like, social media, I feel like people are a lot more accepting of like marijuana use specifically.
Yeah, I think for definitely it's like the government, and then definitely a lot of it's like I come from immigrant parents, and you come from immigrant parents.
Yeah.
The same. It's like, I think a large part of it's just like how people, like, really see the world, to tie it back to self, right? You grow up a large part of your life, like, living, like, your parents' virtues, you know, and parents, like, morals, and, like, obviously one day you're supposed to become your own person, you know. And so, but, like, that, to tie stigma back into the self, like, if you really think about it, like, certain stigmas do shape your personality, and do shape your sense of self.
No, 100%. And you know what's funny also with stigma, but just about COVID in itself, and this is a funny one. I feel like the stigma against coughing and being sick grew exponentially.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, people didn't take it serious before. Like,
yeah, you know, like, people would just cough, and, like, some people wouldn't even cover it before.
and even I was talking to Dubs, and, like, he was telling me about, like, like the stuff we were doing. Like, we literally stand right beside each other. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that, like, is so normal to us, like, so many years ago. But now, it's a crazy thought, right?
We're like, oh, you're standing too close.
Yeah. And, like, if you think about that, right? And how, like, you have anonymity, and it's the desire to fit in and connect with others, but also having a sense that you cannot achieve such a thing. This can translate into feelings of isolation and have disconnection from cultural normalities.
Yeah. Like the world kind of shut down in 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and that put us into, like, everybody was into isolation. And honestly, tying it back to the Anami, I personally, like, never felt such a strong need to want to connect with other people
Mm-hmm.
prior than the first lockdown. And, like, I felt isolated, but it's because I knew that I couldn't see anybody, like, other than the family that I lived with. I felt the need to connect was stronger. So we talked about Anami, and we talked about stigma and the sense of self. But now we're going to talk about a concept that's a little bit more abstract, and that's abjection. And that's a state that we can find ourselves in. So, like, when you see a corpse, or you see, like, a bloody wound, you just feel very, like, horrified and disgusted, and I feel like kind of drawing away from the substance use for a little bit and going back into COVID. Being sick, especially during the pandemic, is a great example of abjection, because individuals who are sick are outcasted,
Yeah.
And I feel like, personally, I felt in a state of abjection when the pandemic begun, because I was, like, horrified whenever somebody coughed or they said that they tested positive.
Yeah. I know what's it called. I never got COVID, but, like, the thing is, like, my biggest fear was always, like, I'd feel bad about getting everybody else sick.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That was one of my biggest fears. And, like, did you feel any of that? Like,
yeah, especially because when I got COVID, it was when my family was visiting. So I felt really guilty. I was like, what if I got somebody sick? And I felt like if they knew, I would be an outcast. And it would be such a negative thing. They would have so many negative feelings towards me being sick. And in class, we actually mentioned that COVID-19 amplified objections, because inequities place targeted groups of individuals at a higher risk of contracting the virus. So, like, we would see homeless people, and we would look at them with more disgust than people already had, because they're like, oh, they're outside, they're more exposed to the virus.
Yeah.
They're more susceptible to contracting it.
Like, like, now touching people is, like, it's such a foreign, like, concept to, like, people,
Yeah. And those who couldn't or still can't quarantine in a place alone, they have to display their symptoms in front of other people. So, like, even now, us doing this podcast, me coughing, like, sometimes that's even awkward.
Yeah,
depending on the person.
Especially at the start of COVID.
Yeah,
I remember being on the TTC, and I'd hold my cough in for as long as I could.
Yeah.
I'd have tears in my eyes before I started coughing in public.
Yeah, like, we laugh about it now, but it's something that's, like, real, But those who are, let's say, privileged, have the ability to be in complete isolation and don't have to deal with that situation of having to display their symptoms in front of others. That can be seen as a privilege.
And that like, when we're talking about, like, how people, like, they don't have, like, the same circumstances, right? and bringing it back to like addiction, it's like one thing that people like don't not everyone realizes is everyone's home life is not a good home life, you know.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of people are trying to get away from things, you know, and maybe it's not physically, like obviously there's horrible cases where people are abused, but it's also just mentally, like being locked up, not having like your friends as a sounding board to, in a way, like your community keeps you sane, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Like you hear so many people that go crazy in isolation, so for them it's like once again it's like a coping mechanism, and like to tie into like mental illness, like you know you have like things like anxiety, you know, like
Yeah.
I have friends that get terrible anxiety just being at home, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And like I've seen them, like they've been worked through like their anxiety, and like also like trying to battle through like depression and stuff like that. It's just it's hard on people, and it just like in like you lose your sense of self, you know. Just to bring it back to what we were first talking about.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. So, going back to the concept of objection and how we can tie that into substance use, you know, how people portray, or specifically the media, um, and a lot of stigma behind drug users like heroin.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a big objection with heroin users because people look at them and they're like, there's such a negative feeling.
Yeah, you know what's it called? It's pretty personal, but you know I tried MDMA, like Molly, or like also like ecstasy, you know, and like when I did it like the first time, and like this sounds very like crazy to say, but like I understood why people like are so like addicted to like things like crack. Like weed brings a certain level of happiness, like marijuana,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Um, what's it called? Alcohol brings a certain level of happiness. But there's drugs like when Molly's just the surface, right? And like in terms of like how like fast, like how many drugs you can get high on, right? And it's like you have this sense of happiness that like you would never like think is real, but it's like a real sense of happiness, and
Like pure euphoria.
yeah, like what's it called? Like you know when you saw Rue in Euphoria when she's like, I'm so happy. That's
Yeah.
what it feels like, you know. And like
Agree.
we judge these people, but like at the end of the day, isn't that what everyone's chasing? Happiness.
You do have a point. So, objection and drug users, for example, heroin users who also happen to be homeless during COVID-19. I feel like the objection was definitely amplified.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people look at drug users like the needles that people use.
Yeah.
Before it was objection with like contracting AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's also about COVID.
Yeah, exactly. And what's that called? Like you see it, right? Like you see people get like stereotyped because of like the way they look, or like what's it called? The way they dress, right? And then that affects their sense of self, and like some people can't like, you know, afford to like have like the almost like the cleanliness that other people have, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Not just homeless people, like people every single day, like you don't know their circumstances, right? And you don't know, especially during COVID, because COVID was such a testing time for everybody, you know. Like
Many people lost their jobs.
yeah, my dad lost his business, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, and you know that just goes to show how much COVID has affected so many different people in so many different aspects.
Okay, now, you know, so moving on to our next topic, you know, our next concept, we have relational suffering. So we have relational suffering. That can be explained as individuals having shared experiences through suffering, and people have been brought together essentially through suffering.
So yeah, that's actually a really good point about people being brought together, like through COVID specifically. You know, there's been a lot of, I've seen on social media, a lot of support groups for those who have lost their loved ones to the virus. You know, and we also mentioned this in class. We said that we were actually inquiring if do things like relational suffering groups promote healing or promote more suffering?
I think they have a positive impact. And the reason I think this is, because when people come together, you're able to get new perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the detrimental things about COVID is you weren't able to get new perspectives when you were with people in COVID. And you get perspectives and, you bounce ideas off of your friends for everything. You have for school choices, for life choices, for, romantic choices, you have, your support group is so important.
You rely on people.
Yeah, and,
it goes the same with suffering. You suffered together.
And the thing was, everyone was trapped.
Yeah.
And that's and I'm fortunate enough that I am in a good environment, but many aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you look at poverty and just our neighbor country, America,
Yeah.
there's kids in very low income areas that are really going through it, and they don't have the basic necessities,
Mm-hmm.
And there's kids in Africa, there's kids everywhere, and just one of the big things that I learned in COVID is you have to be grateful for what you have,
Yeah. And that literally ties into relational suffering, because we here, we're pretty privileged, and we relate to each other in our suffering, especially in COVID. And we didn't even think about other countries and how they were affected by COVID. So, we can't even empathize with that because we can't comprehend it. And bringing it back to the question of does relational suffering promote more healing or more suffering? Tying it into substance use, I feel like collectively, us as friends and just our friend group, everybody kind of had a spike in their substance use. So it was relational healing, sort of.
But it's it depends what people are using your substances for, because if you think about it,
there's a limit.
Yeah, there's a limit, and there's
and that's when it goes from promoting healing to crossing the line and promoting more suffering.
Exactly.
So now moving on to our next topic, and one that basically is what drove us to do this episode today, is rehabilitation. And specifically in class, we talked about the case of addiction. So during COVID, statistically, through the website of the government of Canada, the number of individuals who passed away from opioids usage,
mm-hmm.
Overdose actually, had a dramatic spike
mm-hmm.
during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that says a lot, because during COVID, studies show that the number of individuals who reported abusing substances also had a drastic increase. So, that really correlates how COVID drove people to use more substances. And
do you think it drove them to find isolation, and they found not happiness, but they found
that euphoric feeling that you were talking about?
The euphoric feeling in substance abuse?
Yeah, when there's a fine line between substance use and abuse,
mm-hmm.
you go from a little bit more than recreational,
yeah,
to more daily usage, and then throughout the day.
Because a little bit, it gives you a little bit more perspective, but a lot will take you it becomes a part of you, almost.
Yeah, and you're talking about isolation, and there were quite a few studies that presented evidence that isolation periods, specifically COVID quarantines, had a direct relationship with the increase of substance use and abuse. And that was just in Canada, you know. Imagine throughout the world.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And personally, and I know you too, we both had a drastic increase in our substance use during the lockdown. And there was nothing else to do other than just get high all the time and let the time pass. You know, I found like I wasn't the only one in my circle who did that. And all of us increased our substance usage since the first lockdown. So, you know, just to put some numbers to the phrase, around 2020, you know, like before COVID, the deaths being related to opioid overdose was around like 1,200. And then mid COVID, like summer 2020, it was almost at 2,000.
That's insane. That's such a big jump.
Right. And they have predictions here as to what the deaths are going to look like. And, you know, there's a prediction it's either going to go up, remain steady, or lower. And that obviously depends on a lot of factors like rehabilitation, which is what we're talking about in this context. So, you know, taking it day by day, just one slow step into recovery. And, you know, even us, you know, I've actually been thinking about cutting down on my usage because where do we draw the line of substance use and abuse?
Just in my last paper for this class, I wrote that some days, you know, I felt myself and I was like, oh man, I gotta wake up and like ball, like in our terms, ball up. Like we gotta like I gotta get high, you know?
Yeah.
And that's like
it impacts our daily lives.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting, like, I never would have thought I would have had a thought like that, you know?
It goes back to the sense of self.
Yeah. One crazy thing is, like, when we come back to civilization, when we come back to, like, re-socializing with everybody, like, we used to be such social people, you know? And now, like, we're not. We're almost, like...
We're like hermits.
Yeah, we're hermits. Like we're scared to like go out and like re-socialize.
I feel anxiety when I go out to socialize. Do you feel like you always have to get high before you do something?
A lot of the times, yeah. You know, like sometimes when I'm with like friends, or if I'm like I go to a party, or if I have to like socialize, right? Like not all, obviously not all of my friends, but like some of my friends, I feel like, especially at parties, like I have to be somebody like I'm not that like weed makes me, and like marijuana makes me that like I'm not, but it has changed me. Yeah.
It obviously takes you out of your normal state of being.
Yeah, and not just state of being, but state of environment.
Yeah, exactly.
But now we have to learn to like live again, like how we lived before the pandemic.
And that's what everybody says, going, quote unquote, going back to normal. But who defines normal?
What is the new normal?
Like we never know. We can't define it. And you know, with COVID, when I had COVID, I was scared to go back into society. I was like, what if I catch it again? What if I don't know? What if people stigmatize me? You know, everything just ties into each other. And that's why I really like this class.
Yeah.
You can really relate to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, guys, you know, that was it. We really went in depth into everything that we learned in this course, and I feel like we got a better understanding of how we can actually relate things to real life that we learn in school. And I think that's really important for us to do. So, you know, as always, like, subscribe, and we'll catch you on the next one.